So this morning, our gospel shows us two pictures. One we started with at the very beginning of Jesus triumphantly entering into Jerusalem from the Gospel of Matthew. And the second is what he did after he immediately entered the city. So I'm often one who loves to say that as much as people ask, what would Jesus do? Remember that flipping over tables and yelling at everyone is also a perfectly appropriate thing to do because Jesus did it. So Jesus cleansing the temple is an interesting tableau in the story of Holy Week, one that often we don't even get to lift up because it's only in Matthew's telling of the gospel story of Passion Week that we see it. Now, Luke and Matthew both have the cleansing of the temple. Luke places it at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, and Matthew places it right here, right as we begin the unfolding drama of Holy Week. So what was Jesus doing by cleansing the temple and turning the money tables over and driving people out of the temple? I heard that story very differently this week because many of us have been driven out of our worship space. So what was it that Jesus was up to? Well, I think there's a lot in our world that has been turned upside down and inside out these last 2 weeks. And for Jesus, overturning the money tables, it reminded the people of what the Lord's house should be about. A house of prayer for all people. And I think in these 2 and 3 weeks and then weeks to come, we have seen our worship space turned upside down and launched into the virtual sphere. At the heart of it, though, is the reminder that our worship should be a house of prayer for all people. And so this Holy Week, I think Jesus is also reminding us that we too live in this space of prayer no matter where we are, whether we're in the temple or whether we're in homes. We still gather in prayer and praise to remember the story of God's love for us. And so no matter where we are this week, we will gather and remember and mark the story of the Passion as we walk with Jesus to the cross, where we gather to remember the night that he gathered with his disciples to wash their feet, to celebrate the Lord's Supper. We will gather in a meal to celebrate that we gather with those we love. We will gather at the foot of the cross to remember Christ's passion, his arrest, his trial, his crucifixion, and yes, even his death. Then we will gather next Sunday as we discover the mystery and the wonder of what God can do with the most unlikely of circumstances. This is the story that we will enter into this week, even though we are physically distant, even though we are isolated. The story of God's love continues to ride on to us. And so today, at the very beginning of that story, we mark Jesus' triumphal entry into the city, where the crowds lined the streets and grabbed what they had and lined and said, "Hosanna, Hosanna." This is what we had waited for. This is what we hope for. And as we people wait and hope and pray for the end of this time of isolation and separation and quarantine, as we are people who hope that the curve will begin to descend, we remember that Jesus rides on. Jesus is riding on into this. And I have to know that Jesus knew what was at the other end of his Holy Week parade. I have to know that Jesus knew that he was riding on to the cross, that he knew that he was riding into a mess. And yet, Jesus rode on. And so I think as we continue to see the world get crazier and unravel around us, remember, beloved, Christ continues to ride on into this mess too. And so this week I continue to see Jesus riding on into the hospitals, riding onto the front lines of this pandemic where he is with doctors and nurses, Jesus rides on with those delivery drivers every day, bringing us the necessities that we need to survive this time of isolation. Jesus rides on with all those delivery drivers, bringing us brunch and Friday evening dinners. Jesus is riding on to be with you in your home. Jesus is riding on to be with those who are struggling with this disease. Jesus rides on to be with those who struggle during times of isolations with depression and addiction. Because Jesus isn't afraid of any of this. Jesus looks squarely at it and rides on into this. Because this is the beginning of the story of resurrection. That Jesus is not afraid of death and walks bravely into this. And so Jesus is walking into this with us in this time of quarantine and isolation, showing us what it's like to serve by staying at home, washing our hands, listening to what medical authorities are telling us about ways that we too can help our neighbors by distancing ourselves for a time. And so we follow Jesus into this, saying, Hosanna, Hosanna. Come, great King, and liberate us. This is the hope the crowds felt that day. This is the hope that we feel in these times. Because we know what God can do in the face of impossible odds. It's on our lips already. The hope of the story that Jesus and God turn around death. And so we whisper it now. We whisper it because next week we will shout it gloriously. He is risen, my friends. Whisper it this week and shout it next week. Christ is risen.